Welcome to Don't Cry Wolf. I'm Jimmy Wylie. I'm a malware analyst at Dragos.
I'm Sam. I'm a half and half vulnerability researcher and malware analyst at Dragos, and we're here to talk to you about how we hunt for and assess threats to ICS capabilities in VirusTotal.
So it's 2021, and a customer is asking me for an assist. They sent me a zip file with some stuff to look at, validate some results that another team had done. I take a look. It's fairly straightforward. Identify the thing as Cobalt Strike Beacon for delivering Conti ransomware. The customer is satisfied. I didn't really think any more of it. At that time, ransomware had really started to grow in the industrial space, and this kind of stuff was getting more and more common. A few months later, in 2021, a bio-ISAC partner releases a report on a new APT called Tardigrade. They claim that Tardigrade is targeting biomanufacturing and pharmaceutical companies, and they're doing it with a, quote, extremely sophisticated malware that's a metamorphic version of SmokeLoader, and potentially the first identified malware with this level of sophistication targeting a biomanufacturing facility. The release makes freaking headlines, right? This is 2021. COVID vaccine supply chains are at the top of mind. The whole country is sensitive to pharmaceutical-related news. Wired reports devious tardigrade malware hits biomanufacturing, and they call it a shockingly sophisticated strain, and they make some claims about it being able to operate autonomously. Now, of course, our customers get really concerned. They start messaging us. So we pull the report, and it's the same hash that I had analyzed a few months previously, the thing that I had identified as Cobalt Strike Beacon for delivering Conti ransomware. Bleeping Computer publishes an article on this stuff, and they cite the late Vitaly Kremez, and he comes to the same conclusion that we had. He was like, this just looks like, Conti's Cryptor and Cobalt Strike Beacon. So clearly there'd been some kind of mix-up. Conti ransomware is not a new APT. But because everybody had gotten riled up, we have to address our customer concerns. So we published an internal report, and the whole report was just us being like, hey, just keep doing what you're doing to prevent ransomware, right? There's nothing to see here. Don't worry about this. Just operate as normal. And so, this event really stuck with our team in 2021, and me personally. This misidentification caused a lot of trouble. Some poor analyst was probably sitting at their desk having to answer their manager's questions about what they were doing to defend their network from tardigrade. And I'm not here to drag those analysts. Mistakes happen. That's not really the point here. I'm just advocating for some care and analytical rigor, right? When we talk about these threats to the public as experts, people are listening, and we don't really ever want to be the reason that gets the media, or more importantly, the community, worked up over some shit that they shouldn't be. So, for this reason, we're very careful with our assessments of ICS threats, especially when we're hunting for ICS malware. And to help, we created a process and definition for identifying ICS malware that we apply in our hunting. This is a really quick summary. There's a white paper and other talks on this, but we're going to use some of these terms throughout the talk, and I just want to make sure that everyone's familiar. So for us to consider something ICS malware, it has to have three properties. It needs to be, has to have ICS capable, malicious intent, and adverse effects. So when we talk about ICS capable, what we mean is that the code can do ICS or OT actions. These are things like speaking OT protocols, uploading download ladder logic, code made for interacting with runtimes, or maybe the engineering software. Next, the sample has to be designed with malicious intent. And what that means is that we can find evidence that the software was intentionally designed to cause harm to OT environments. This property is basically the difference between something that is malware and something that looks like malware but is designed for red teamers. And lastly, the sample has to have the ability for adverse effects on OT environments. Now, what this means is that this software can actually cause harm against an OT environment, meaning we can find some negative effect and we can verify that the software works to achieve it. So these are going to be things like stealing sensitive process information, enabling unauthorized access, downloading arbitrary logic or executable code to the PLC. These kinds of things are going to vary from site to site, device, and industry. So there's no go-to hard list or anything. And that's it. We use three criteria: ICS capability, malicious intent, and the ability for adverse effects on OT environments. If we have enough evidence of all three, we consider it ICS malware. If it's less than that, then it's probably just something else, like IT malware, research. It could be a broken tool or something that's in development. And with these criteria, we sort of assess the things that we find when we're looking through VirusTotal.
So part of our jobs at Dragos is to be constantly monitoring and hunting for what we call emerging threats. Right? These might be threats that lurk in our existing data sources like VirusTotal, but are not discoverable based off of known bad indicators of compromise. And there's actually a history of ICS malware or ICS-related malware ending up on VT. So FrostyGoop, TRISIS, and COSMICENERGY were all found there. So whether it's because the defender or an incident responder uploads the capability as part of their investigation, or whether the threat actor actually is uploading it themselves to test the detection rate, these samples continue to end up on VT. And that leads us to our emerging threats hunting hypothesis. And that is, there exists undiscovered ICS malware or ICS-related malware in VT. Of course, the ultimate goal here is to find novel ICS malware or capabilities before their use out in the wild, which is a very short and challenging window of opportunity, but we'll actually have an example of this later on in the presentation, not with something ICS specific, but something a bit more generic. Now, there's a lot of ways to hunt in VT for ICS malware, but I've found that keeping it simple often yields the best results. This mostly means using good old-fashioned strings, and the obvious method here is to grab ICS-related strings, right? Whether it be protocol names, vendor names, makes and models of PLCs, those are all good places to start. Additionally, from samples like Pipedream and FrostyGoop, we've learned that threat actors are using open source libraries to build tools like Mousehole or FrostyGoop, right? Why build your own OPCUA protocol stack if there's one on GitHub? Same with FrostyGoop. Why build a whole Modbus TCP stack when you don't need to? There's plenty available. So narrowing down on ICS-related strings from open source libraries is a really good way to dial in on that ICS-capable component. We've also seen ICS malware utilize popular programming languages like Python, Go, and .NET. Of course, we've seen binaries written in C and C++, but focusing first on languages that make triaging efficient is a lot easier, and hence why we focused on Python and .NET first. You can be looking at the original source code within minutes, and that makes static analysis much, much easier than something like C or C++. And finally, we look for malicious strings or CVE identifiers or even more generic stuff like words like exploit or attack. That has often led to some interesting samples. So that's a very quick and high-level word on how we do our hunting and the strategies we take to narrow in on that potentially ICS malicious component. Now let's look at some of the more interesting samples we've come across during our hunting. These could be standalone tools that demonstrate some of the challenging assessments we've had to make with limited visibility, primarily just being the capability itself. So we'll start with a tool called IoT Exploit. So TRISIS was Python malware with ICS-related strings, and so learning from that, we want to hunt for ICS or Python malware with ICS-related strings. So we stumbled upon this massive zip file about 0.5 gigabyte in size containing a bunch of NuICA-generated Python binaries. These are Python to C transpiled code, so it's an absolute mess to disassemble or decompile and statically analyze. And the file names and the file paths, the modules, are obfuscated as well. Thankfully, we got a bit lucky. So the author had incorporated a bunch of doc strings into their code in basically every place they could. And so here's actually a screenshot of one of them. You can see it defines the class and the functions that it takes or that it has. And it turns out by doing a simple little Python trick, you can actually pull out these doc strings from the NuICA-generated Python binaries. And that makes analysis a ton easier. This is equivalent to running help on a Python module. So we're able to learn a ton from basic static analysis of strings as well as some of the more unique byte strings that were actually contained in the ICS-related exploits.
All right, so here are the highlights from the analysis, right? One, y'all might have noticed in the last screenshot, there's a bunch of Chinese strings. We translated all of them. One of them was identification, and that translated to IoT device vulnerability scanning, verification, and exploitation toolkit. The tool has over 1,000 exploits targeting IP cameras, routers, and industrial devices. In the ICS category, IoT exploit has roughly 175 tools for publicly disclosed vulnerabilities from common OT manufacturing products like Siemens Cymatic and Rockwell Automation, Micrologix. And it provides at least partial support for 19 industrial protocols, things like Ethernet IP, FINS, and Modbus TCP. Now, when we assess this tool against our criteria, the ICS capable and adverse effects properties are straightforward. We consider it ICS capable for all the protocols it speaks, even though it's partial support. It works to deliver the exploits, and the adverse effects protocol is derived, the adverse effects property is derived from the effects of the exploits. So they can do things like denial of service or enable unauthorized access and these types of things. When we were trying to assess the sort of malicious intent behind the tool, this is where things got a little bit more challenging. This is another screenshot. The tool includes a JSON file with detailed vulnerability information like CVSS strings and public advisory information. And this sort of thing seemed more applicable to mitigating vulnerabilities than an offensive operation. And it just generally features a lot of what we call dual use dilemmas. These are features for which both offensive and defensive use cases can be found. The big one here just being the exploits in vuln scanners, right? That could be used for an unauthorized intrusion, or it could be used for a red team. Another example, it can detect malware, right? Classically defensive, but also adversaries may want to detect if the box they're on has been compromised already. We found persona information, and we were able to find the related organization. But after investigating that organization, we realized that it does both offensive and defensive research. So the tool could just as easily support either. So the persona information was a bust. The binary analysis was inconclusive. The OT exploits were for publicly disclosed vulns. There were no evidence of 0 days, and we had no evidence of the tool's use or any other intelligence on it. To us, that's just not enough evidence for malicious intent.
Yeah, so we concluded that this is probably not ICS malware and more likely to be an ICS red teaming tool. Still, even a non-malicious tool can be used for malicious purposes, so we reported on this internally, we got detections out to customers, etc. The lesson here when we're dealing with samples like this is to stick to the facts, right? It's really easy to jump to conclusions in a case like this. Oh my gosh, it's from an adversarial nation, it can exploit ICS, it must be bad. But we have to remember that other countries want to protect and defend their infrastructure as well, so they'll develop tools, including red teaming tools, to do it. Of course, with new information, assessments can change, but staying unbiased while looking for evidence of malicious intent prevents worst-case scenarios from tainting our analysis and helps us reach a sensible conclusion.
So next, we're going to talk about a tool called Kurtler SCADA. This tool was found with a simple query. We were looking for Python scripts with SCADA in the name submitted from Iran. Right, even before the U.S. decided to bomb Iran, that area was seeing all kinds of geopolitical tension. At this point, we were seeing a lot of the hacktivist groups like Cyber Avengers express increasing interest in attacking OT systems. Now, Kurtler SCADA is a compiled Python binary, and decompiling compiled Python is usually pretty straightforward with tools like PyCDC or uncompile6. And to start the decompilation, you need to know which version of Python that you're dealing with. Usually, you can just do a simple string grep for this. But in this case, the Python version was too new for uncompile6. You can see here, this is like Python 3.12. Basically, anything before Python 3.10 is fine. Anything after that, you're going to have some trouble. But luckily, there's this new AI-based transformer tool called Pylingual, and that supports 3.10 and later, and we were able to use that to get a good decompilation of the tool and basically read the code.
So after reading through some of the decompilation, we realized this tool is basically a glorified VNC client. That is, Kurtler SCADA would accept a list of IP addresses that had to be generated by the operator, probably using Shodan, then iterate over each IP address, brute forcing the VNC server's authentication mechanism with a small list of hard-coded credentials. If it's successfully connected, it would then capture a screenshot of the compromised server, just basically proving access. So now by pivoting off of the tool's name, we were able to discover a Telegram channel. This is where an actor was boasting pro-Iranian and anti-Western ideology, selling the tool to their roughly 3,500 followers, even offering discounts for those targeting the West. So Kurtlar Cyber Lab, the Telegram channel, had about 7,000 subscribers at the beginning of July, but then was just a few weeks ago was banned by Telegram. But backup channels exist where they're still operating, although with a lot less of a reach. So now using the tool, the actor actually compromised dozens of HMIs. They posted a video of them mass scanning and mass exploiting them, and of course posted screenshots as well. Here you can see two screenshots, and if you look closely, you can see a couple images that have been added to the HMI screen of Elliot from Mr. Robot throwing his hands in the air after a big successful hack, I would assume. So they actually went and took steps to modify the HMI screen.
So this tool isn't complicated and it lacks any real ICS capability, right? It's just a VNC client. So we weren't considering it ICS malware, but the fact was the campaign was targeting ICS organizations and HMIs, and that's a serious problem. So we contacted CISA and worked with them to notify the victims. The main takeaway here is that ICS targeting malware doesn't need to be sophisticated to be effective. I don't think y'all can actually read the caption here, but this is just a video of opening a master lock with a hammer. So if you just take a crowbar and a hammer and hit the lock, it opens up. So Kurtler SCADA is just an instance of hacktivists using low-hanging fruit techniques against poorly secured internet-exposed HMIs. And the good news here is that since these techniques are basic, the defenses don't have to be complicated. Like, just use a better password and you'd be fine.
Okay, so hopefully you can read this, but this is from the vendor of one of the compromised HMIs targeted by Kurtler SCADA, and I'm actually going to read a couple sentences here from it. So, VNC can have several layers of security. The VNC client must give a password before connecting. Blacklist may exempt certain machines from connecting. Non-standard port numbers may be used, etc. We have currently chosen not to implement these means in order to avoid too much complexity. They're saying we know what we should be doing, and we aren't. Right? Of course they got compromised, and state of security, I guess, huh? So while Kurtler SCADA was a cool win, most samples aren't usually as clear-cut. So let's look at a similarly named tool, the fake rapid SCADA masquerade. So we found this while searching VirusTotal for files that contained any CVE tag that had 5 or more detections and had SCADA somewhere found in the metadata. Now, Rapid SCADA is a legit open source industrial software for building SCADA systems. As the sample's name suggests, it pretends to be an update for Rapid SCADA. The sample is actually a zip file that masquerades as an executable. And inside the zip file, there's a fake README batch file which abuses CVE 2023-38831, which is a WinRAR arbitrary code execution vulnerability. This vuln has many public proof of concepts. It has been exploited in the wild by different threat groups, but the file that we had didn't align, and the TTPs that we were seeing didn't quite align with the behavior from those groups.
So here's how the exploit chain works. A user is sent a zip file via an email. The user opens up the zip file with WinRAR, and more importantly, they preview the zip file in WinRAR. And when they preview the readme.txt, it's a sort of malformed PNG that kicks off the exploit. This is going to cause a batch file to execute. This batch file will then modify the shell open command registry keys associated for various browsers, along with the HTTP and HTTPS protocols. The effect here is that when the user tries to open up an HTML file or a URL, it's going to cause this encoded firmware.exe binary to execute. Now, once that thing launches, one of the first things it does is it kills a task called SCADA_manager.exe, and then it moves on to searching the desktop directory for PDFs, XLS files, docx's, and files with power plant SCADA or firewall in the name. It then sends these files to a custom C2 server that's hard-coded in the binary. Now, most of the evidence pointed at this binary being a custom, although weirdly specific information stealer, since it's just looking at the desktop directory. They use an exploit. There's obfuscated scripts and binaries. They're stealing potentially sensitive documents, and it had a very clear ICS angle with the sort of masquerade as Rapid SCADA. While we didn't think this was ICS malware, again, because there was no real ICS capability here, we thought that maybe we had another Kurtler SCADA type situation where the thing was targeting ICS organizations. And then we found this. The C2 server had a shared SSL certificate with a domain operated by hackrocks.com, which is a CTF and security training website.
So there goes our malware theory, right? Not only did it lack ICS capability, but this evidence meant that really malicious intent isn't there either. So we contacted HackRocks, tried to determine if it was one of their exercises, and after multiple attempts of emailing them back and forth, we just gave up because they fully stopped responding to us. So while it could have been a stolen certificate, it seems a lot more likely and plausible that this is a custom challenge designed by HackRocks. Frustratingly, sometimes one piece of high-confidence evidence nullifies 8 pieces of evidence to the contrary. But that's our job, right? We're just here to follow the evidence and accept the reality given by the facts, even if the result's a bit unsatisfying.
All right, so next we're going to talk about some .NET Modbus samples that we found. So we were searching, using YAR, we were searching for .NET executables that statically linked to open source Modbus libraries. And we found a whole cluster of samples, and they all share similar patterns. They're all .NET, they all download and execute a second stage, and they contain the Easy Modbus library. Now, what was weird about this is that most of the samples don't use the Easy Modbus library, meaning it's imported, but the code never calls into it, except for one sample. One sample actually uses a couple functions from the library, and that's what we're going to talk about.
All right, so I'm gonna walk through some of the code here. A lot of it was obfuscated, but the symbols have been renamed and such. I've done most of the renaming, so hopefully it's something sensible. But we start by importing the easy Modbus library. We then connect to that LDUG hostname over port 502 with a Modbus client connection. Then separately create an instance of a strange class that I'm just gonna refer to as the Z class. So next, we're going to download, deobfuscate, and execute a binary it fetches from Discord's content distribution network. So let's zoom in on that function. Here we are. So this code issues an HTTP GET request to Discord CDN, then does a base64 decode, and finally, it does a swap character algorithm to get the plain text and well-formed binary. When that binary is executed, it returns an IP address. The sample connects to that IP address using Modbus and then just doesn't do anything. Unfortunately, at the time of researching this, the second stage payload, which was being hosted on Discord, was no longer available, nor was it captured by VirusTotal, so we lost visibility into that capability. We don't know where it was connecting to. We don't know what other functionality it had in it.
So we don't have any evidence of victims or targeting, so with just the binary behavior alone, we can't really say for sure if this sample has any malicious intent aside from it just being weird. Further, since it doesn't actually issue any Modbus commands, right? If you notice, the very first time it initiates a Modbus connection, there's no control commands after that. And then the second time, it just connects again to an IP address and issues no control commands. We can't actually assess any kind of adverse effects here because we don't know what it's trying to do. In our assessment, it's not ICS malware in its current state. It might be eventually. It could be in development malware. It could just be a toy, research project, whatever. The point here really is that you have to remember that malware analysis is an intelligence discipline. In this case, the capability alone was not enough to make a decision, and we need more context around how it's used, by who, or for what before we can say anything else. Sometimes we just don't have enough high confidence information or find too many reasonable alternative explanations to prevent any kind of high confidence assessment. So, sure, it might look like a duck, walk like a duck, quack like a duck, but if it's like a duck robot store down the street, you have to consider whether or not you have a duck robot.
Okay, so we've covered 4 samples all related to ICS in some way today. The first was IoT exploit tool. That looked real nasty right off the bat, but after further investigation, more than likely just an ICS red teaming tool. Then Kurtler SCADA claimed to be some sort of OT malware, but kind of a glorified VNC client, not that impressive technically. There was the Rapid SCADA Masquerade, which used an exploit that has been seen exploited out in the wild by various threat groups, and it appeared to steal ICS-related files. Turned out to be probably a CTF. And then finally, there were the .NET Modbus cluster of samples, which were malware lookalikes, right? It was a downloader capability that executed a second stage, made 2 Modbus connections, but then issued no control commands for whatever reason. These examples, they remind us of 2 things. The first is that simple queries, like the ones we've demonstrated or shown in this presentation, they take a lot less time to make and yield really interesting results. Something as simple as a Python artifact plus some ICS-related keywords can give you plenty to look at and to hunt in, like the Kurtler SCADA tool that was found legitimately targeting HMIs.
And the last point here is that without a careful, evidence-driven process, any of these 4 samples could have easily turned into a tardigrade type situation, right? Claiming that some sample is ICS malware when it isn't, or overhyping some sample as more dangerous than it is, stirring up headlines, causing headaches for ICS defenders, having to answer to their managers or just do a bunch of extra work that isn't necessary for a threat that probably isn't, a problem or threat to their network. So, by taking care in our investigations, we retain the trust of the community so that when the real bad shit comes through, people actually listen to us. Anyway, so thanks for coming to our talk. We appreciate it. These are our dogs. They help us out.